And I think in the year ahead, as I mentioned, we expect copper volume growth, both at the short end of our portfolio on the producing side, but also de-risking events, medium and longer term. And I think that that aspect of our portfolio is increasingly going to get highlighted. And I think Ecora investors are really well positioned to benefit from our copper growth profile.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Ecora Resources CEO Marc Bishop-Laflèche. Marc, very good to speak with you. You've announced your fourth quarter results this morning. Could you talk us through some of the highlights?
Well, it was a very strong quarter and a great way to end 2024. For the year, we saw a total portfolio contribution of approximately 63 million, so that's up 9% on 2023. And we also had two records in our portfolio in the period. The first was at Mantos Blancos. We saw in Q4 a record level of royalty income generation. And second, a record level of production at Voisey's Bay in the quarter from the underground. And that's as that asset ramps up towards steady state production in 2026. So it's great to see at Voisey's in particular that inflection point in volumes, given this asset has seen its timeline delayed. But to give you a bit of context around what the steepness in the ramp up at Voisey's means for Ecora. In Q4, we saw 7 deliveries of cobalt, and that compares to 4 in Q3. But if you look at it on a sort of H1 versus H2 basis, it's even more stark, where we saw 11 deliveries of cobalt in the second half of the year compared to only 4 in the first half. So that volume growth is expected into the future at Voisey's, and it was a great way to wrap up the last quarter of the year.
Marc, it seems like base metals is going to be a big driver of growth as met coal winds off.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case with the portfolio that we've built. And we just touched on Voisey's, but to frame it slightly differently, at Voisey's in 2024, for example, we received 210 tons of cobalt. That's expected to grow in 25 to somewhere between 340 and 390 tons. And then once the mine is fully ramped up, we expect somewhere in the range of 560 annually, 560 tons annually on average for the remainder of the mine life. So, when you compare 560 versus 210 in 24, that's just under 3 times. And then at Mantos Blancos as well, we saw higher mill production in the last quarter of Q4. And that's expected to continue on to 25, so a higher level of just base level income. But then beyond this, Capstone Copper is targeting the completion of a feasibility study for the Mantos Blancos Phase 2 expansion, and that's scheduled to complete by the end of 2025. And then the third layer of growth we see at Mantos Blancos is from the potential retreatment of high-grade tailings, which wouldn't require any additional mining or crushing costs or substantially more infrastructure, but could mean approximately 25,000 tons of copper for 15 years. And keeping in mind that the production levels at Mantos Blancos last year were less than 50,000, that's potentially a 50% uplift.
Looking ahead to the outlook for 2025, what are going to be some of the key growth drivers, Marc?
Well, I think when we look ahead for this year, we've spoken already about Voisey's Bay ramp up. That's something the market will be looking at very carefully. And we also think, as I mentioned earlier, the Phase 2 expansion at Capstone Copper, in addition to that, the potential to unlock substantial value by the tailings retreatment would be a lot of growth, but that's really at the beginning of our producing portfolio. And over the course of this year, we expect as well that some milestones and just general progress in relation to our near-term development stage royalties, in particular Santo Domingo, where as those come into production, I think that should give the market a lot more comfort in an area of our portfolio, which at times has been overlooked, it seems. But looking out 5 years, when you think about our copper exposure, and from where we're starting today in 2025, there's an expectation that from 24% base metals in 2024, there's an expectation to that to be the vast majority by the end of the decade.
More broadly, are there any particular themes that Ecora is set to benefit from in the year ahead?
Yeah, there's probably three key themes. I think first is that there's been a broadening of the drivers behind the electrification trend. And by that, I mean, in the past couple of years, the electrification trend was almost viewed more narrowly through the lens of energy transition or decarbonization. And I think it's increasingly clear that the energy transition or decarbonation is just a subset of a much wider story. And that story includes a number of broad electricity demand growth factors, which include things like digital infrastructure, the commercialization and implementation of AI-related applications and services, the attractive relative cost levels between small-scale, localized renewable power generation versus the historical model, which entailed sizable upfront investment, centralized generation and distribution, particularly in emerging or developing economies. And then longer term, of course, robotics. So, I think the electrification trend is only going to, I think it's going to become much more of a broader story, but I think that structural trend is going to be deemed to persist in a way that, was subject to some level of debate when folks considered what the impact of energy transition or decarbonation would be. I think the second trend is it's a continuation of a trend really that's been generating a lot of noise in the sector, and that's just the strong fundamental outlook for copper. And I think in the year ahead, as I mentioned, we expect copper volume growth, both at the short end of our portfolio and the producing side, but also de-risking events in the medium and longer term. And I think that aspect of our portfolio is increasingly going to get highlighted, and I think Ecora investors are really well positioned to benefit from our copper growth from that copper growth profile that at times can be overlooked. And then last, I think in the year ahead, I don't think this will surprise anyone, excuse me. I think personally that there'll be a lot of volatility in the market. And of course, we all know volatility can create opportunities.
Mark, I hope you'll keep us posted on any progress on any of those opportunities that come your way. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's Ecora Resources CEO Mark Bishop Lafleche.